Our ability to set healthy boundaries has a direct impact on our mental health and well-being. Alas, setting healthy boundaries is not as obvious and intuitive as eating healthy or working out. What exactly is a healthy boundary? A boundary is a limit in the space between us and other people. When this boundary is healthy, both we and the other person have enough freedom to be ourselves without hurting in any way each other. In different areas of our lives, the boundaries that we set may be completely different. So I'd like to specify that in this video, I am going to be talking about the healthy boundaries that we set in the workplace, but which could very easily apply to other areas of our life as well. First of all, what are some examples of a healthy boundary? When we have a deadline in our work and we can't find enough free time, we might not help a colleague who needs our help. When we are stuck somewhere, we might refuse our colleague's offer to help because we want to fix the problem ourselves. While we're having lunch with a group of colleagues and someone starts gossiping, even though we might feel pressure to engage in the gossip, we decide not to. There is a common component to all these examples: us. It is us who set our boundaries, and what qualifies a boundary as healthy is it benefits our well-being. In other words, setting healthy boundaries is our responsibility. Sometimes the other person does not like or even agree with the boundaries that we set, but as long as it is our boundary, they have to respect it and behave accordingly towards us. There are different types of boundaries. For example, a colleague of ours is not comfortable with physical touch, and so does not welcome it and declines it when someone else uses it. This is a typical physical boundary. Another example is we don't like the way someone talks to us, and this is an emotional boundary. From very loose to very rigid boundaries, healthy boundaries fall somewhere in between the two. We should be careful in recognizing when our boundaries or a boundary is too rigid or too loose. We set our boundary so that it protects us from any kind of harm, but the moment it keeps people at a distance from us, then our boundary is too rigid. And if a boundary ends up with us pleasing everyone around us, then our boundary is too loose. The thing with rigid and loose boundaries is that we tell ourselves that we do have boundaries, but if we stop and admit to ourselves, these boundaries are still hurting us, but in a different way. Some people may go to these extremes because they tell themselves that rigid boundaries will protect them from others and loose boundaries will allow them to get along with everybody. Both these boundaries are in fact not healthy. Not setting boundaries or having unhealthy boundaries does not allow for strong and meaningful relationships in our workplace. The very first relationship that a lack of unhealthy boundaries hurts is our relationship with ourselves. We could waste time, money, or any other resource, leading to more stress, which in turn leads to us resenting those people that made us waste that time or money in the first place. We feel angry at them and at ourselves too, which does not help us build, maintain, or improve any relationship at work. What's even worse is that unhealthy boundaries at work transfer the anger and resentment that we feel at work into other areas of our life outside of work as well. On the other hand, setting healthy boundaries in the workplace reduces the stress that we experience at work, which leads to more fulfillment at work and a happier personal life as a result. We can set healthy boundaries in the workplace through a 4-step process. Step number 1. In our process of setting healthy boundaries, we should start with being kind and compassionate with ourselves. We should accept the fact that by having and setting healthy boundaries, we are not being mean towards other people. Instead of thinking that having boundaries will damage our relationships, we should understand that they actually make relationships stronger. This becomes very easy to realize, especially if we have had issues in the past with setting boundaries. We are not taught how to set boundaries. It is something that we learn as a result of different experiences and different exchanges that we have time and again with different people in our life. Setting healthy boundaries is something that we do for ourselves. What is best for us? We should draw a limit between what we are comfortable with and what we are not comfortable with. Doing this also helps us steer clear of the extremes, the rigid and the loose boundaries. Step number 2, recognizing and defining our boundaries. There are 2 components to this: recognizing the boundaries that are lacking in our life, or whether we have issues setting boundaries, and determining our boundaries. It could be that we have healthy boundaries with the colleagues that we are friends with, but not with others or one person in particular. To recognize whether we have issues setting boundaries or if we haven't set a healthy boundary in one particular relationship, we could ask ourselves questions like, do we feel like people or one person in particular takes advantage of us? Do we tend to defend and over-explain ourselves? Do we feel like we need to always help others regardless of whether that means having to sacrifice something or not? For example, always saying yes to people, even when we want to say no, making ourselves always available, is one thing that shows that we have an issue with setting boundaries, because this impacts all our relationships. If instead we, for example, wanting to be a good friend to a particular colleague, we try to be a good listener and listen to what they are going through, but then when our colleague doesn't do the same for us, we continue behaving in the same way as before, in this case, a boundary is lacking in our relationship with this particular colleague. Once we recognize that there is a boundary missing in our relationship with a group of people or one particular person, we can then determine the boundaries that we need to set with them. To realize what our boundaries are, we should take baby steps. If so far we haven't been good with setting boundaries, then even the more reason to take it slow, because we don't trust our judgment yet. For example, if we've been hurt in the past by people that were close to us, instead of setting very rigid boundaries, which would probably be our go-to to make sure that nobody can hurt us because nobody can even get close to us, instead we can start taking small steps with simple, healthy boundaries. If those people who hurt us in the past would, for example, never listen to our problems and every conversation revolved around them, then we could set a boundary that states that whenever we have an issue, we will bring it up and occupy part of our conversation with the other person dedicated to us and to our issue. Even through this boundary alone, we can start filtering out those people who could potentially hurt us. We sometimes don't realize that we have a certain boundary until it's been crossed. This is yet another reason why we should take it slow. Sometimes there are boundaries that are small, but which we realize are important to us. And then sometimes there are boundaries that are more complex, and we need to either identify them clearly, or if we can't do that yet, we need to break them down to several simple ones. By taking baby steps repeatedly, we learn to know ourselves better, to trust ourselves and our judgment, and we become able to recognize the boundaries that are important to us and hence the boundaries that we should set. Step number 3, communicating our boundaries. Setting healthy boundaries includes communicating our boundaries well. That means we should pay attention to what we say and how we say it. What we say has to do with what we are not comfortable with and what we are comfortable with. A boundary that we could set with the people we work with could be not connecting with them on social media. Even though our colleagues might do it, if it makes us uncomfortable, then we can tell them that that is something that we just aren't comfortable with. That's it. In the way we communicate our boundaries, we could be assertive or aggressive. We can be assertive by remaining consistent in our boundaries, and that is not to say that our boundaries will never change, quite the contrary. But we shouldn't display a boundary at this moment and having it changed entirely by the end of the day or the moment the other person questions it. To be assertive, we should state our boundary in a calm and confident manner. We do this by sticking to what our boundary is and why it is important to us. For example, the colleague with the physical contact boundary can state their boundary by saying the following: I'm not really a physical person, this is nothing personal with you, I just don't like physical touch. Next time you need to, for example, get my attention, you can just call my name. More often than not, this kind of boundary is communicated after it's been violated. In this case, our colleague could say, I know you are used to showing your affection by touching people, but I'm not really comfortable with that. One important ingredient of assertiveness in communicating our boundaries is showing the other person that we appreciate their understanding and respecting of our boundary. If our colleague declines physical contact but does not state that physical contact is something that they're not comfortable with, then that is not a good way of setting a boundary. It is crucial that we communicate our boundaries to others. We should never think that a boundary that we have is obvious and that everyone else should have it. We should say it. Very often we start resenting someone because we think that they don't respect our boundary, but If they don't know what our boundary is because we haven't explicitly told them, that resentment inside of us is not because of them, it's because of us. 3 points of caution here. First, when setting a boundary, we shouldn't excuse and over-explain ourselves. We all have the right to our own limits and having them respected. Second, we should focus on ourselves only. For example, we should never say, "You shouldn't bother me when you see me working." Instead, we could say, "When I'm doing deep work, I'm entirely focused and I'd really appreciate not being interrupted." And the third point is, we should be prepared for the consequence of our boundary being violated. We should be very clear with ourselves and the other person that should they violate our boundary, there will be consequences. They don't have to be, scary consequences. We don't need to say it as if we're threatening the other person. If you don't respect my boundary, then there will be consequences. We could say something like, "If you continue asking me questions while I'm working, I'll have to put on my earphones." I should point out that this is to be done if the other person has already violated our boundary before. Sometimes we don't even need to voice the consequences if our boundary is violated, but we ourselves need to know what the consequences are, and when our boundary is violated, we need to uphold those consequences. And step number 4, maintaining our boundaries. Setting healthy boundaries is not a one-time thing. We are constantly changing, all of us. So pretending that a boundary that we set once when we were 11 years old with our friends will still be valid when we're 31 is not realistic. Even in a short period of time, we might change a certain boundary in our life. Healthy boundaries are flexible. We should keep an open mind and acknowledge and consider events that happen in our workplace that could change our boundaries. For example, it could very easily happen that we grow closer to a small group of colleagues which have earned our trust. With this group, we can loosen up our boundaries because it is safe to do so. If something happens and one colleague in our group violates this trust, then we can tighten our boundaries up with this person. On the other hand, sometimes we may need to enforce our boundaries on people who keep disrespecting them. In this case, we may have to bring out the big guns, consequences. Instead of just knowing what the consequences of our boundary being violated is, we should tell it to the person who violated our boundary. If we are consistent and firm, the other person should apologize and change their behavior to respect our boundary. If not, we need to reduce our interactions with them, or worst case scenario, and this is for people that we don't necessarily have to work with, we might have to cut them out of our life altogether. Setting healthy boundaries is very important for our life, and as such, we should pay attention to our own boundaries. In order to set boundaries, we need to first understand what it is that we need and want from each of our relationships, what boundaries will make sure that we get what we need and want, and then clearly communicate these boundaries to the other people. To set healthy boundaries, we need to stay away from 2 extremes, rigid and loose boundaries. Keeping rigid boundaries does not allow for people, things, and experiences to enter our world. Loose boundaries make us lose ourselves in everyone else. Healthy boundaries, on the other hand, allow us to keep ourselves mentally and emotionally healthy while nurturing us with what is outside of us and good for us. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in next week's video.